Michael Hungerford. I'm a partner at Hungerford Properties, and I'm a founding partner at 7 Generations Capital. Well, Indigenous development is really an exciting and emerging part of our local economy, and it's actually something that's inspiring nations across the country to take a leadership role in and around community development. Indigenous lands are spread throughout urban centers and rural centers across the country. And in BC here, we have about 200 First Nations. Just in the Lower Mainland, there's 24. And there's a significant amount of undeveloped reserve lands, and then additional lands that these communities are getting back from government. So communities, especially in urban environments, the biggest asset they have with their lands, rather than say resource sector, which might be more for rural communities, in an urban environment, these communities have tremendous value in the land itself. And so developing the land through residential, commercial, mixed-use type development is an important way for the community to build wealth in a economy in which they've been largely left out, right? So as we learn more and more about, as Canadians, in our journey around truth and reconciliation, we start to understand how these communities have not been able to participate in land development in the past, and the importance for them to identify proudly in projects and to develop community goals around financial inclusion, environment, and social and cultural inclusion and benefits. Well, Indigenous development is different than traditional development in a sense, like our own company's name is 7 Generations Capital. And so as an Indigenous person who identifies as Indigenous through my mom's side of the family, I've been taught values that are really longer term in nature. 7 generations is about respecting 7 generations into the future, as well as respecting 7 generations in the past. And so it's a longer term, community-centric approach to land development that's very different than shorter term, transactional type developer mindsets. So that's one big difference, is the timelines around development are different. Ultimately, the shareholder or the person that's being served through this work is the community members themselves. And so that's also different, right? So including the community in the process of the development and the vision and then the execution and the benefits of a project is a really different kind of development model that we see today in these projects. Yeah, sustainability is obviously a really important value that Indigenous communities have. It's thinking about that 7 generations principle again, of thinking about how decisions today impact a long period of time into the future. I think that mindset is really one to admire, and allows projects to make really long-term decisions and investments in projects that do good for the environment and our relationship to the environment. So we see that over and over again in Indigenous project development, where there's a long-term understanding of the land and the relationship to plants and animals and the environment. That knowledge that comes from elders is really important to incorporate into learnings that allow projects to be successful in the long run. And then we're looking to build in Indigenous projects the highest levels of environmental standards. Typically tends to be, because of the longer term thinking and the values alignment of community, environment has a higher priority and tends to, those investments are welcome in projects. So we tend to see less intense land use in many cases and more investment in building systems and building technologies that are more sustainable. The challenges that Indigenous projects face today are not unlike any other project that we see in the market. There's challenging headwinds in geopolitical, financial, demand side markets. However, Indigenous projects have advantages. So Indigenous lands tend to, well, they're just federal jurisdictions. So there's no regulatory or tax jurisdiction for provinces or cities. And communities are able to work through land use and avoid a lot of burden of tax and regulatory that most projects would be under pressure with. So it's actually, I think an advantage situation, a jurisdictional advantage that Indigenous communities have today. but it is a challenging market overall, and so one has to be really careful and risk manage projects. Across the next 12 months, I think we're going to see uncertainty in the market, of course, but Indigenous communities aren't as affected by short-term volatility, because there's a long-term lens through which projects are viewed and community development is looked at. It's not as acute an issue around shorter-term volatility. There's a really important movement here around self-determination and understanding the why of why these projects are important to communities. It's part of their inclusion in the economy. It's part of giving their identity and culture a voice. It's part of creating economic reconciliation, jobs, procurement, training, and capacity building. That's a movement that is much bigger than 12 months, and it's really going to happen over the next decades and generations in a really exciting way. And British Columbia is really well positioned for that with our rights and titles, the location of Indigenous lands relative to urban centers. You're seeing a lot of really innovative and exciting land use planning happening in our region, and it's really becoming a role model for the rest of Canada to follow. And I've traveled across the country, and people look at what nations are doing here in British Columbia with inspiration, and it really is time for the Indigenous economy within the country.